Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Sean McMeekin. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. It didn't get a lot of attention, but Donald Trump campaigned on a promise in his Agenda 47 to, quote, establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to declassify and publish all documents on deep state spying, censorship, and abuses of power. Senator Josh Hawley, a Missouri Republican, sounded a similar note after Matt Gaetz dropped out of the running for Attorney General, posting on X, "We need a new church commission to bring to light all the abuses at DOJ and FBI of the last decade, from the Russia hoax to the illegal spying to the infiltration of Christian churches. It must all be made public, and then there must be top-to-bottom reform." That would indicate a, quote, Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a church commission is likely to be incoming under a second Trump administration. With his very close ally, Pam Bondi, in a strong position to be confirmed as Attorney General by the Senate, Trump will have a lot of power to just open up the records. Of course, many of us remember he already did kind of kick the can into 2021 on releasing the last classified files related to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, citing ongoing security and foreign policy concerns. Joe Rogan pressed Trump on this right before the election. Trump pointed the finger partially at Mike Pompeo. He said he thought Pompeo made a, quote, reasonable ask at the time because some people were still living who could be endangered. And Trump also mentioned the existence of Martin Luther King Jr. files and UFO information. Take a listen.
One of the things that I want to talk to you about is the JFK files. And one of the things that you said was that if they showed you what they showed me, this was your quote, you wouldn't want people to know it either.
So I opened them up partially. I was met with, from good people, good people. People that were well-meaning. Mike Pompeo was one of them. He's a good person. They called me, they said, "Sir, would rather have you not." And I did open them. But I was asked by some people not to open them. There's a Martin Luther King file, too, by the way, that they'd like to see. I don't know if you know, but there is that. But JFK in particular. So they called me, a lot of good people called me, people that that you would find reasonable people. And they asked me not to do it. So I said, well, we'll close it for another time. But if I win, I'm going to open them up. I'm just going to open enough time.
Why didn't you open it up the first time?
Because a lot of times,
what was the hesitation, though?
Addresses, people that are still living. There are people that are affected. And there could be some national security reason that I don't have to necessarily know about. But some very good, talented people asked me not to do it.
So in that clip, you heard Trump say he thinks it's going to be just fine, like a cleansing, to open up these files, and that he is going to do it almost immediately. That could mean we are a matter of weeks away from this information. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., another close ally of Trump's and now potentially a member of his cabinet, has long been, unsurprisingly, a serious proponent of declassifying the files about his uncle's assassination. He also believes the man in prison for the assassination of his own father is innocent and suspects CIA involvement in both killings. The pledge in Trump's Agenda 47 plan is pretty broad, covering all deep state spying, surveillance, and abuses of power. How far back could that go? Would this be done via a Hawley-style church commission, literally resembling the committee Frank Church assembled in the Senate after Watergate in 1975, producing bombshell information over and over again about abuses at the FBI and the CIA? Sean McMeekin is an influential historian of the Cold War and a professor at Bard College. His latest book, released just this September, is To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. He's also the author of Stalin's War, a very popular book on the subject. McMeekin took to the pages of The Federalist in recent days to lay out a plan for Trump to urgently stop agencies from now, even today, overclassifying documents. McMeekin reflected on his own experience as a historian trying to piece together what happened during the Cold War, writing of the, quote, enormous back catalog of older documents still classified by the U.S. government, some nearly a century old. The CIA claims to have released the last classified World War I documents, but millions of World War II files remain closed, said McMeekin. While researching my book, Stalin's War, he continued, I discovered that many of the files on Lend-Lease aid to the USSR were declassified only in the 1970s. While I was not surprised, owing to long experience with Russian archival restrictions, that Soviet files concerning the scale of American military and material aid are tightly guarded, undermining, as they do, cherished myths about the Great Patriotic War. The Russian government recently shut down its only Lend-Lease museum, said McMeekin. I could not fathom why information about U.S. generosity had been classified in Washington. McMeekin says Trump can and must stop new secrets from festering day by day right now, and he must reveal those old ones too. Sean McMeekin joins us now to explain more. Sean McMeekin, thank you so much for being here.
No, thanks for having me on, Emily. It's a great pleasure to be here.
No, of course, I wanted to start with something you wrote in The Federalist. You say, quote, frustrating as Russia's recent nationalist turn and the shutting off of archival access has been for Western historians, most of us expect secrecy from Moscow, but we have a right to expect better from our own government. That to me seems like a really important argument. Could you flesh it out a little bit? And especially as a historian who's actually gone through archival documents from the Cold War on both the Soviet side and the US side.
Well, that's right, Emily. I mean, I've been working in Russia for the better part of a quarter century or perhaps a little bit more. And I always felt fortunate just to be let into what used to be the Central Communist Party archives. They're now called by this acronym Argaspi. I used to feel incredibly fortunate just to be let in. A lot of materials redacted, and certain archives, the way they're designated over there, some are actually run by government ministries. So the ones run by the foreign ministry or the army are extremely difficult to get into even now, and they'll really only give you material at their own discretion. And one's run by a government agency, it sounds a little confusing, called Rosarchiv, or at least relatively speaking more open, but there were always restrictions. But I always just kind of thought, look, I'm glad they're giving me anything. I mean, sometimes I would find this amazing material on, for example, in the Russian Revolution, witness deposition reports after the July days, just because some researcher handed it to me and I never would have found it otherwise. I was always grateful. And some of my Russian friends would actually get a little suspicious. I'd be carrying around this briefcase with microfilm. So you're stealing our national secrets, they would say. And I kind of understood. I mean, here I am. I'm not a Russian citizen. I don't pay taxes over there. I can't really demand transparency from the Russian government. I'm not a subject or a citizen of that government. But as a U.S. citizen and a working historian, but primarily as a U.S. citizen, I do think that I have the right to demand a certain level of transparency from my own government. We do have the FOIA Act dating back to 1967. But what's odd about it, a lot of Americans kind of talk about it as if we sort of revere this. You know, oh, this is great. We have the Freedom of Information Act, which means we can sue the government to possibly obtain access to government files from decades ago. So facto absurd if we're supposedly a representative democracy that boasts of being a kind of a world leader in all kinds of categories. We're certainly not the most transparent. To give you an example from another government, the United Kingdom actually revamped their own classification protocols and procedures in actually a law that was enacted by Parliament in 2010. And they have now declassified everything. They started with 30 years, and they've now brought it down incrementally to a 20-year law. And so basically anything 20 years or older you can now see in the UK. In practice, I'm sure there's still some materials that are secret or classified in the UK. But at least in principle, you don't have to apply for permission to see anything 20 years or older. It's just open to you. It's open to the public in Kew Gardens. And we have nothing like that in Washington. I mean, we have these so-called 17, apparently it's now 18 intelligence agencies, and they all have their own little classification protocols, and they're guarding their secrets like terriers. Believe it or not, there's actually a declassification department at the National Archives now, and I just looked at their website yesterday. I was curious. What are they doing? You know, what are they declassifying? And a lot of it was trade files from the late 50s and early 60s. There are a few materials that have to do with Department of Defense kind of experiments and nuclear missiles from the 50s. There was actually one report on, I believe it was something like the tactical use of atomic weapons to support infantry. This was prospective because it didn't exist yet. This dated to 1937. So they're boasting about how they just declassified some files from 1937. That's where we stand with our government in Washington.
This episode is sponsored by Lumen. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it actually lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, your workouts, your sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do, it's so easy, is breathe right into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. Lumen will tell you if you are burning mostly fats or carbs. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. It's so amazing. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. Again, that is incredible. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. It can also track your cycle as well as the onset of menopause and adjust your recommendations to keep your metabolism healthy through hormonal shifts so you can keep up your energy and stave off those cravings. So if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/undercurrents to get 15% off Lumen. Great deal. That is lumen.me/undercurrents for 15% off your purchase. Say the Trump administration is serious about tackling the issue of declassification. What could they do? What steps could they take? I mean, you've mentioned a couple of things that already exist. For example, a declassification department at the National Archives, or the FOIA Act that is law that Americans are very proud of, but the implementation is obviously a bit bigger of a question. So Donald Trump takes office. He's serious about it. The people around him are serious about it. What steps could they take right away to start tackling this problem?
Well, to begin with, I think the FOIA Act is a little bit of a crutch for the government. It's not just that they have these exemption categories they use to deny the requests, but the very principle of it is kind of backwards. Again, the principle is that everything is classified unless citizens sue the government to make it unclassified. It should be the government instead that has to basically request classification. I mean, according to an executive order passed by President Obama in 2009, ordinary files should not be classified longer than 10 years anyway. And the maximum for even the most sensitive files was set at 25 years. I think that could easily be reduced to 20 years, which would bring events such as 9/11 and the Iraq War into play, which obviously there's intense public interest about. I mean, there was even a DNI statement, a kind of resolution passed in 2015, basically saying we do want to release information of public interest. For example, the JFK assassination files, if everything be declassified by 2017. I mean, they literally gave them 25 years to do this, and it wasn't done. So apparently, even an act of Congress is not quite enough to actually get the U.S. government and its security agencies to pony up. But in theory, an act of Congress shouldn't even be necessary. While the way they did it in Britain is maybe ideal, that you actually do have a parliamentary act, which is binding. I mean, I guess this is the problem when people talk about controversial subjects such as immigration law. A lot of it is no longer even really done through legislation. A lot of it is done through these executive orders. And so, of course, they could be passed by one president and revoked by another president. So maybe instead of an ideal world, we would have an act of Congress that would actually declassify everything older than a certain amount that would then be binding on all future presidents. But in practice, assuming that's politically unrealistic, I mean, I think part of the problem with Congress is not just that there's so many members of Congress who have these ties or cultivate ties to the national security establishment. I think a lot of them also take deep pride in their security clearances and of being in the inner club of secrets. I mean, there's obviously just this prestige, almost a snob appeal to having a security clearance. I mean, it's become almost a religion in Washington. And so it would be great if Congress would act. But even in the absence of Congress acting, the president absolutely has the legal authority to declassify documents. I mean, maybe not if they're appointed by the president, but at least some of the lower ranking bureaucrats in some of those agencies might resist and they might object, and they're going to come up with these exemptions, as they call them, national security exemptions, sensitive information, private bank data. They can have all kinds of potential objections. But the thing is, as someone who's worked in archives for years knows, you can open files even with information redacted. I mean, some of us have seen those famous CIA-approved books with pages and pages of things blacked out. I mean, ideally, you don't want it all to be blacked out, but they can black out a name or a bank account number or private medical data, and they can still release the document. I think the burden of proof should be put on the security agency to claim why they're keeping material classified, particularly if it's material older than 20 years old, or material that is 50, 60, 70 years old, related to the JFK assassination or Watergate or the Gulf of Tonkin resolution or the Second World War, for that matter, Pearl Harbor, intelligence on the German nuclear program. There are all kinds of things still classified from the Second World War, which is absurd. The Second World War ended nearly 80 years ago. I can't imagine why some of these secrets are still worth keeping. Or if they are worth keeping, then let the agencies submit special requests to the president or to some presidential task force that might be appointed in order to evaluate those claims. I think the burden of proof should be on the government, not on the people.
Senator Josh Hawley called on Thursday directly for a church commission, another church commission. This is in the wake, it seemed like it was in the wake of Matt Gaetz dropping out of consideration for attorney general. But, so maybe it's his scope of a new church commission would be more recent than a lot of the potential areas that we could learn historically from that you just mentioned. But do you think the Senate, Church Committee itself was a Senate Select Committee. Do you think there's a way that if the Senate were to assemble a new Senate Select Committee along the lines of what Frank Church did in the mid-1970s, that actually they could get a lot of information historically? They could broaden the scope and go back and start really digging and reveal a lot.
Yeah, I think Hawley, if I read the story correctly, might have been talking more about trying to dig down into what's been going on in the Justice Department, but obviously the CIA and the NSA and all these other agencies, I think, would be equally ripe for this type of a commission and hearings and questioning. Congress absolutely has the legal authority to request the declassification of government materials. In fact, to some extent, one might expect that Congress would have gotten involved sooner. After all, part of the role of the Congress is supposed to be to oversee the executive branch. One kind of understands, even if one maybe would rather be the other way around, that members of the executive branch might have a kind of a selfish personal interest in keeping materials secret, particularly if they reflect badly on them. If something maybe is unflattering and shows that they might have been abusing their power. And it should be the role of Congress to request this. Like I said, ideally, Congress would actually pass a law stipulating documents older than a certain amount would be classified. But if there's national interest and concern related to abuses by the Justice Department, CIA, FBI, et cetera, I think that type of a Senate commission, a church commission style body would absolutely be welcome. Ideally, they could work together with the executive branch. And it shouldn't necessarily always be adversarial. If the executive branch itself, maybe under new leadership, actually does want to declassify and open up files to the public, then Congress, one would think and expect, would want to encourage that. Again, I think politically, for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like Congress has gotten that directly involved other than in the 1992 Act regarding the JFK assassination files. Maybe matters of particular interest might be of special interest to this or that congressman or senator. But I think more broadly, I think that Congress could absolutely play a constructive role in urging along the type of transparency that one would hope the new White House would be in favor of.
And something that you've thought about, but a lot of people, it doesn't come immediately to mind, myself included, when we're thinking about the question of classification, is the immediate ongoing process of classification that happens every day, every hour of every day at those 18 intelligence agencies, as you mentioned. So what does that look like? What is problematic about how we are currently classifying documents, and what can be done about that as well?
Well, it's clearly an abuse of power, if nothing else, that the government is now classifying. Again, this is just according to publicly available information, which was released by the Senate earlier this year, that something like $18 billion a year is spent on classifying basically new information every single year. And I assume it's probably going up. It probably goes up every year. Probably by a year or two from now, it'll be $20 billion and maybe $25 billion. The number of documents, apparently right now, it's something like 50 million documents a year. And again, one assumes that's going to keep going up. There were periodic attempts to streamline the process. This executive order dating back to 2009. There was a kind of DNI resolution in 2015. But again, so far, nothing's really been done. I think because the will wasn't there. And to some extent, maybe it wasn't really made a priority in any of the recent presidential administrations. I think ideally you would get some really good minds on this. Historians, it would be great if they could get some historians involved. Possibly some lawyers, if there are some issues regarding resistance coming from the agencies. Obviously there might have to be a court decision at some point if there is resistance coming from the agencies. But ideally, again, Congress could kind of sweep through all of the legal difficulties and pass a law broadly declassifying information. And moving forward, again, just limiting the authority of these agencies to be able to classify willy-nilly. Again, rather than classifying by default, they should have to, particularly if it costs a lot of money to classify things. Just the physical cost of kind of all the stamps of the documents and then presumably whatever storage they're being kept under, all the different procedures regarding security clearance, access, and all the rest of it. If it really does cost billions and billions of dollars a year then why not just do less of it? That is, make the default that documents are not classified unless some type of special application is made in order to declassify certain materials. I'm sure some type of a working compromise could be arranged. And the amount, just the incoming flood of classified documents, I think absolutely has to be reduced. I think just eventually, it's not just for the public interest, but even just for the long-term logistical problems. I mean, eventually, I suppose a lot of it will end up in the cloud somewhere, and maybe there will be fewer paper files. But of course, we also don't want the files to disappear. We want them to be preserved. And so I think that's also important. I think the preservation of government documents is equally important. I know there are already some controversies about paper shredders and that sort of thing going mad in Washington and one doesn't know what rumors to believe. But I think the preservation of government documents should be equally a priority. That is not just declassification, but also the maintenance of the government records and the opening of them to the public.
And so Donald Trump, on his actually now very famous interview with Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan Experience, talked about how very gently he criticized Mike Pompeo for being one of the people that told him not to declassify probably the 1% of the remaining 1% of Kennedy documents that we don't have access to, Kennedy assassination documents that we don't have access to. But Donald Trump said it would be cleansing, that it is now totally time to do this. It will be fine. If you were in a conversation with Mike Pompeo, Sean, and he was saying there are people still alive who will be affected by this, and there are national security concerns, and we could speculate all day about what those might be. As a Cold War historian, I'm sure you have many theories yourself, but if you were in that conversation sort of weighing the costs and benefits and the risks about declassifying information that could relate to people who are still alive, for example, what would you say? How would you respond? Just, as I'm playing devil's advocate here, from the national security standpoint, somebody who really loves their clearance and really loves those secrets, how would your counter argument look?
Well, I think it's actually not that complicated. That is to say, if they're worried about the names of, let's say, U.S. government agents or informants on the payroll who may still be alive, who might be abroad, who might be that's the only argument that I could possibly think of that might cut any weight. You open the file and you redact the name. I really don't think it's that complicated. That sounds to me like an excuse. I obviously don't know because I haven't seen the 1% of JFK assassination files that are still classified, so I can't speak with any authority on what is in there. Something to do with intelligence sources being protected. That sounds rather dubious to me, and I think it probably sounds dubious to most other historians who have tried to look into the assassination and all of its implications. No, I would say that, again, the burden of proof would have to be on these people. I don't know how Pompeo was able to convince President Trump not to declassify. I suppose Biden made a very similar decision several years ago, again, to open some of the files, but to keep that proverbial 1% still classified. Now, we're now talking about more than 60 years ago, and so even if there are a few sources left, presumably they're now fairly elderly. One would have to maybe go through on a case-by-case basis, but I really don't see any reason why those cases couldn't be discussed confidentially, somewhere in the White House or in the National Archives, and some type of a compromise is reached where the files are open and perhaps one or two names have to be redacted. Obviously, that would fuel even more speculation. We were always going to wonder, why are those names redacted and who are those people? But I think, once again, the burden of proof should be on the government. And because it's such a high-profile example. I mean, there are obviously a lot of other examples, 9/11, Cushing Report in recent years. Part of the problem I think we're dealing with here is, there may or may not be a few sources the government is still trying to protect. But the public has a right to know, and the mania for secrecy in Washington, I think, has contributed very powerfully to the public distrust and just the lack of faith in the U.S. government, which has become almost epidemic. Just the corrosive cynicism, I think, which has infected the body politic. I think it's long past time for house cleaning.
I'm curious about the history of classification in the United States, because part of this is the story of technology, but even just thinking back to what it would have been like during the founding of the country, whether it's here in the United States or in other places around the world, but particularly as it relates to our own government processes. You mentioned FOIA coming out of the 1960s. How have we historically thought about what should be kept from the public, or what the public is entitled to do throughout American history?
Well, I think like so many things, this changed after the Second World War, where it's not that no documents were classified before the Second World War, but it certainly was not some ordinary or common practice. In wartime, there's always been a little bit less transparency, more opacity, and this is true even of things like civil rights, obviously with the passage of certain acts regarding sedition against the government, which dates all the way back to the 1790s, but there were acts passed, particularly in the First World War, trading with the enemy act, and all kinds of things where the government, frankly, started doing some things they probably shouldn't have been doing. I think that's probably when it really did start to classify and keep files from the public. But it really was, I think, dating back to, I believe the year was 1947, where the first kind of serious, both the metastasization of the security state, but then also this ramping up of the classification protocols really began to ramp up in the late 1940s. And like so many things, it was, I think, in part an imbalance that then emerged between the executive branch and the legislature. A lot of it going back even to the Lend-Lease Act, which I talked about in my book, Stalin's War, where Congress began to forfeit a lot of its authority just basically to try to keep tabs on what the executive branch was doing. There's still a little bit of balance for a while, but eventually the balance tipped over, I think, almost entirely towards the executive branch. And again, the default effectively became then classification, so that nearly everything created by those security agencies was kind of marked classified, almost as a matter of course. And the 1967 Act, the FOIA Act, was meant as a corrective. It was a recognition that there was a problem. But again, I think in the long run, the unintended consequence of that was to reinforce that slightly backwards principle, as I was talking about, that is that the burden of proof is effectively on the public, on the taxpayers, the people who are actually, of course, paying for this government, rather than on the government to determine what is classified. I think, again, there are a lot of things in U.S. history that have precedent. Some things maybe seem completely unprecedented. I think we just have to ask ourselves, if we can go back to the Constitution, we can go back to speeches made by political leaders over the time, but so many people in the American tradition have talked about the importance of transparency. I think it absolutely should be a cardinal principle of the U.S. government. I think we've been getting it wrong for at least about 80 years.
Yeah, I mean, just as like an amateur, someone listening to this, I'm thinking to myself, well, part of it has to be we just had so many more ways to write stuff down. I would imagine, before we had some of these technological tools, everything that was urgent had to be done in person. You didn't have the option to send an email, send even, a telegram. You didn't have the option to pick up the phone and have that be recorded. I mean, we started recording so much in that time period, even to your point, the last 80 years, that the way that we think about our relationship to the government and how we're a part of the process, it seems like it's changed just because of some of the technology too. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. It's just me sort of rambling as an amateur.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, our whole relationship with the government has obviously been transformed. There's a famous story about Warren Harding answering callers at the White House door in person. That sort of thing would be obviously inconceivable today. So everything from the president's security detail to housing millions and millions of documents under lock and key. This, again, we could say it's not American practice or American tradition. Obviously, it has been American practice and tradition for a long time, but that doesn't mean that it's right. Just because, let's say, Congress has not formally declared war since December 1941 doesn't mean that Congress should have abdicated its authority over the war-making power of the United States. There are a lot of things that maybe used to be done that aren't done anymore. And just the physical problem you're talking about with the accumulation of documents, I mean, this is obviously a problem. I mean, you need more and more space to house them. To some extent, part of the problem that I've encountered at times in the archives is also that, we should be fair to archivists. It's also it's difficult work just to organize and catalog materials. When I used to work in the Moscow archives, there was one archive that was specifically devoted to materials. Basically, the Red Army's looting detachments had taken back from occupied Germany through most of this stuff, and they never really bothered poking through it. And back in the 1990s, it was amazing, but these historians would come over, some of them representing class action law firms who were suing for compensation for slave labor victims. And oftentimes they'd be in the same room with representatives from German companies like BMW or Allianz, who were over there trying to research their own corporate files, which are now in Moscow. It's a logistical problem. They hired some East Germans back in the 50s to start going through it, and they never really finished the job. I think to this day it hasn't all been cataloged. The U.S. government, though, it's obviously it's a big operation. It has a huge budget, or I would say I think the UK maybe have some problems there, but they actually do this better than us. The National Archives of the United Kingdom in Kew Gardens is extremely efficient. You can get materials there very rapidly, oftentimes within the hour when you order them. They have begun to limit the kind of the quantity. But they do a great job of organizing and opening materials to the public. And the National Archives in Washington, maybe the volume is larger, so I wouldn't gainsay the difficulties involved in the enterprise. And some of the material that's been microfilmed is actually very easily accessible to the public. But a lot of the rest of the files, I mean, the very fact you often have to file a FOIA request just to access it shows that, again, the default, is on the people kind of doing more of the legwork themselves. I think in the end, these agencies, the National Archives, along with the security agency, should simply be reminded that they work for the people and not the other way around. But that's not to say that the obstacles are real. I mean, obviously, it's difficult to handle the incoming flood of material. I honestly think that making it more difficult to classify material would also reduce the load, would lessen the burden on the government. But still, storing material, I suppose eventually, once it's all electronic, you might not need as much physical space. But even then, you're going to need, obviously, some pretty efficient software and certain protocols, again, to prevent materials from being destroyed once they exist only in the cloud. And I think that's above my pay grade, figuring out how that could be done.
That is so fascinating. Sean McMeekin, thank you very much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me on, Emily.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. I love Cold War history. I'm just kind of a loser like that. So any opportunity I have to bridge the gap between the old and the new and the very immediate new. I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier, this means we could be actually weeks away from putting together the final puzzle pieces in some really important historical events. Who knows whether or not that's true, but what Donald Trump said on Joe Rogan's show indicates that it's very likely. I mean, he'd have to answer a whole lot of questions about going back on that if he doesn't, quote, almost immediately declassify those Kennedy files. And with all of the momentum now towards significant reforms at the Department of Justice, we talked about this with Josh Hammer on the show last week, that would almost certainly involve significant reform to the ways that we classify documents. That's actually at the center of one of the attempts to indict Donald Trump, or one of the attempts to convict Donald Trump was him declassifying, or his storage of classified documents. Hillary Clinton obviously battled accusations about that as well. And honestly, it's because we're overclassifying stuff all of the time. And as Sean McMeekin just told us, that does really change your relationship with the government, and it changes the way that the government operates every single day, because they know that relationship between the voter and the politician or the bureaucrat or law enforcement is fundamentally different when you have these norms and standards. So if Donald Trump wants to change Washington, this might be one significant place for him to start. So stay tuned. We will certainly be covering this as the inauguration approaches and the first 100 days of the Trump administration commence after the holidays. But we are here, of course, every day, Monday through Friday, with new content at Undercurrents. So subscribe here on the Undercurrents channel. Give us a like, give us a comment. It helps a ton. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv if you want the full premium experience of the show. We'll see you soon.